The stadium lights cast long shadows across the wet grass as Walt Greene stood on the sideline, his weathered hands gripping the headset with an intensity he hadn't felt in decades. 4th down, 2 yards to go, state championship on the line. And somehow, impossibly, he was the one calling the plays. The roar of 15,000 voices from Millfield and Riverside filled the October night air. But all Walt could hear was his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like it had 40 years ago, when he wore number 12 for these same Millfield Eagles. The scoreboard glowed 21-20 with 3 minutes left, and Walt's mind raced through every play he'd ever learned, every mistake he'd ever made, every dream he'd thought was buried with his Letterman jacket. His arthritic fingers fumbled with the play chart as memories of that magical 1983 season flooded back, the year he'd led this same team to glory, the year that defined him before life got complicated. The Friday night lights had always been sacred in Millfield, Texas, where high school football wasn't just a game, but a religion. And tonight felt like divine intervention. Walt had come to this stadium as a spectator, an honored guest celebrating the 40th anniversary of his championship team, planning to shake hands and share old stories before heading home to his quiet retirement. But fate had other plans, and now he stood where he'd always belonged, not in the stands watching history, but on the field making it. The weight of legacy pressed down on his shoulders as he realized this wasn't just about one game. It was about proving that some fires never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to ignite again. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Millfield, Texas had always been the kind of town where Friday nights meant one thing: Eagle football under the lights at Memorial Stadium. Population 8,200, nestled between cotton fields and oil derricks about 2 hours southeast of Dallas. It was a place where 3 generations of families filled the same bleacher seats, and everyone knew the starting lineup by heart. The water tower, painted in green and gold, dominated the skyline, proclaiming home of the 1983 state champions, in letters that had faded but never lost their pride. Main Street still buzzed with talk of that legendary season, 40 years later, as if it happened yesterday. Walt Greene had lived in the same ranch house on Pecan Street since 1985, the one he'd bought with his wife, Sarah, when dreams of college football scholarships gave way to the reality of working at Millfield Feed and Supply. At 61, his once golden hair had turned silver, and his quarterback build had settled into the comfortable frame of a man who'd traded two-a-day practices for morning coffee and the newspaper. The walls of his den were covered with faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, frozen moments from when he was the king of this small kingdom, throwing perfect spirals and impossible touchdowns. His daughter Emma had called that Tuesday morning, her voice bright with excitement, as she coordinated the anniversary celebration from her home in Austin. "Daddy, they want you to be the honorary captain for Friday's game," she'd said. And Walt could hear the pride in her voice that still made his chest tight after all these years. "Coach Ramirez says the whole town's been asking about you, wanting to hear those old stories again." Walt had agreed, partly because he missed the attention, but mostly because he missed feeling like he mattered in the way that only small-town heroes understand. The Millfield Eagles of 2023 were a different breed than Walt's championship team, faster, stronger, more sophisticated in their schemes and training methods. But they carried the same weight of expectation that had pressed down on Walt's shoulders 4 decades earlier. The burden of a town that lived and died with every snap, every yard, every Friday night under those sacred lights. The current team was 8-2, fighting for a playoff spot in a district loaded with talent. And their young quarterback, Tyler Mendez, reminded Walt of himself, cocky enough to believe, scared enough to work harder than everyone else. Coach Miguel Ramirez had been an assistant when Walt played, a young defensive coordinator who'd watched from the sidelines as Walt engineered comeback after comeback in that magical 1983 season. Now 55 and in his 10th year as head coach, Ramirez carried the pressure of following in the footsteps of legend, trying to return Millfield to championship glory while honoring the ghosts of seasons past. He'd invited Walt not just for ceremony, but because he believed in the power of legacy, the idea that championship DNA could somehow transfer from one generation to the next. Walt's Thursday had been spent at the school, walking through hallways lined with trophy cases and team photos, shaking hands with teachers who'd been his classmates and custodians, who remembered cleaning up after his championship celebration. The building had been renovated twice since his time, but the smell was the same: floor wax and teenage dreams. The particular mixture of hope and anxiety that filled high schools everywhere. He'd stopped at his old locker, number 12, now bearing someone else's combination but still holding the ghost of his presence. The phantom weight of shoulder pads and the memory of pre-game butterflies. That evening, sitting in his recliner with Sarah, bringing him sweet tea, Walt had felt the familiar stirring that came every fall when the lights went on and the crowds gathered. He'd coached youth league for 15 years after his playing days ended, and he'd always wondered if he had more to give. If the fire that burned so bright in his teens and 20s still flickered somewhere inside his aging body. Tomorrow night, he'd find out, not as a player this time, but as a symbol of what Millfield football could be when everything aligned perfectly under those Friday night lights. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made Texas football feel like destiny. Walt stood in his closet, running his fingers over the green blazer the school had provided for honorary captains, feeling the weight of expectations settle on his shoulders like shoulder pads he hadn't worn in 40 years. Sarah had pressed his khakis and shined his boots, treating the evening like the formal occasion it had become in Millfield, a town where honoring football heroes was as sacred as Sunday service. The pre-game ceremony was scheduled for 6:30, an hour before kickoff, giving Walt time to meet with current players and share stories that had grown more legendary with each telling. He'd spent the morning reviewing old game film that Coach Ramirez had digitized, watching his 18-year-old self thread passes between defenders with a confidence that seemed impossible now. The plays looked simpler then, but he remembered the complexity of reading defenses, the split-second decisions that separated victory from defeat, the weight of an entire town's hopes riding on his right arm. At the school, Walt found himself in the coach's office, surrounded by whiteboards covered in X's and O's, playbooks thick with decades of accumulated wisdom. Coach Ramirez was pacing, his usual pre-game energy amplified by the pressure of playing rival Riverside High, with a playoff spot on the line. "Walt, I gotta tell you," Ramirez said, his voice tight with stress, "these kids could use some of that championship magic you had. They're talented as hell, but they're pressing, trying too hard to make something happen instead of letting the game come to them." The weight of mentorship settled on Walt's chest as he watched the current Eagles run through warm-ups. Their movements precise, but lacking the loose confidence that championship teams possessed. Tyler Mendez, the senior quarterback, kept glancing toward the stands where college scouts sat with notebooks and stopwatches. The pressure of potential scholarships written in the tension of his shoulders. Walt recognized that burden. The way dreams could become anchors if you weren't careful, dragging you down instead of lifting you up. During the ceremony, Walt stood at midfield as the public address announcer recounted his accomplishments: 3,200 passing yards, 34 touchdowns, the game-winning drive against Highland Park in the state semifinals that people still talked about in barbershop conversations. The crowd rose to its feet. 15,000 people, acknowledging a man who'd given them the greatest sporting moment in their town's history. But, as Walt waved to the crowd, he felt the familiar ache of time past. The bittersweet realization that his moment in the sun was 40 years behind him, preserved in memory but not repeatable. The game started poorly for Millfield. 3 turnovers in the first quarter, putting them in a 14-0 hole that had the home crowd shifting restlessly in their seats. Walt watched from the honorary guest section, his hands clenched in frustration as he saw the same mistakes he'd made as a young player, forcing throws that weren't there. trying to be perfect instead of being smart. At halftime, with Millfield trailing 21-7, he found himself walking toward the locker room. Drawn by an impulse he couldn't name, Coach Ramirez intercepted him in the tunnel, sweat beading on his forehead and desperation in his eyes. "Walt, I know this is crazy, but would you mind talking to these kids? They're in their heads, playing not to lose instead of playing to win. Maybe hearing from someone who's been where they want to go." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk, the chance for Walt to step from observer to participant, from memory to reality, from has-been to mentor. The Millfield locker room was a temple of controlled chaos. Players slumped on benches with their heads in their hands, while coaches frantically adjusted game plans on portable whiteboards. Walt stepped into the humid air, thick with sweat and frustration, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space until Coach Ramirez called for attention. "Gentlemen, I want you to meet Walt Greene, quarterback of our 1983 state championship team, and I asked him to share some wisdom about playing under pressure." Walt cleared his throat, looking into the eyes of 17 boys who seemed impossibly young yet carried the same weight he'd felt at their age. 40 years ago, I stood in this same locker room, trailing Highland Park 17-3 at halftime in the state semifinals. He began, his voice finding strength as the words came. "I was so scared of letting you all down that I forgot the most important thing: you can't play scared and win. Football's about controlled aggression, about making decisions fast and trusting your preparation. Right now, you're thinking too much and playing too little." Tyler Mendez raised his head, his young face marked with grass stains and determination. "Mr. Greene, how do you stop pressing when everyone's watching, when you know people are depending on you?" The question hit Walt in the chest, recognizing his younger self in the boy's vulnerability. "Son, pressure's a privilege," Walt replied, remembering the words his own coach had spoken decades ago. "It means you're good enough for people to care. Don't run from it, use it. Let it sharpen you, not scare you." The second half began with Millfield moving the ball effectively, Tyler loosening up and finding his rhythm as he completed 3 straight passes to cut the deficit to 21-14. Walt watched from the sideline, invited by Coach Ramirez to stay close to the action, feeling his pulse quicken with each snap, as if he was still the one taking the hits. The crowd sensed the momentum shift, their voices rising in hope and anticipation. The collective belief of a community starting to believe in magic again. But with 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter, disaster struck in the form of a twisted ankle that sent Coach Ramirez to the ground in obvious pain, his leg bent at an angle that made Walt wince. The team doctor and athletic trainer rushed onto the field as the stadium fell silent, the weight of crisis settling over Memorial Stadium like fog. Assistant coaches huddled frantically, trying to maintain composure while their leader was helped to the locker room, leaving them to navigate the most crucial moments of the season without their captain in the chaos that followed. Offensive coordinator Jim Bradley approached Walt with desperation in his eyes and a headset in his hands. "Walt, I know this is insane, but Mike's asking for you. He says you know these plays better than anyone, and with your championship experience." The headset felt impossibly heavy in Walt's weathered hands, the weight of responsibility and opportunity colliding in a moment he'd never imagined possible. 40 years after his last snap, Walt Greene was being asked to coach again. The stadium seemed to hold its breath as Walt walked to the sideline, the crowd recognizing what was happening even before the public address announcer explained the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to Coach Ramirez's injury, Walt Greene will be assisting with play calling for the remainder of the game." The roar that followed was part shock, part hope, part belief in the kind of small-town magic that only happens when necessity meets destiny under Friday Night Lights. Standing on the sideline with the headset crackling in his ears, Walt felt 40 years collapse into a single moment as muscle memory and championship instinct flooded back like a dam bursting. The plays were different, the formations more complex, but the essence remained the same: finding mismatches, exploiting weaknesses, staying one step ahead of the defense. Tyler, he called the young quarterback over, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders the way Coach Henderson had done for him decades ago. Forget the scoreboard, forget the crowd. See the field, trust your eyes, and let your arm do what it knows how to do. The first play Walt called was a simple slant route, something to get Tyler's confidence back and establish rhythm. But the execution was perfect, a tight spiral that hit the receiver in stride for a 12-yard gain. The crowd erupted as if they'd scored a touchdown. Sensing that something special was happening, that the ghost of championship past was somehow present in the man wearing khakis instead of coaching shorts, Walt felt the old electricity coursing through his veins. The addictive rush of calling plays and watching them unfold exactly as designed. With 5 minutes left, and trailing 21-14, Walt reached into his memory bank and pulled out a play that hadn't been run in Millfield since 1983, Heritage Right. A bootleg action pass that he'd used to beat Highland Park in the state championship game. He explained it quickly to Tyler, drawing roots in the dirt with his finger. Watching the young quarterback's eyes light up with understanding. This is how we won it all, son. Trust the play, trust your legs, and when you see the linebacker bite on the fake, hit the tight end over the middle. The play unfolded like poetry, Tyler rolling right as the defense bit on the fake handoff. The tight end slipping behind the linebacker exactly as Walt had drawn it up. The pass was perfect, the catch secure, and suddenly Millfield was in the red zone with new life pumping through their veins. Walt felt tears sting his eyes as the crowd went wild, the sound washing over him like baptism. Confirming that some gifts never fade, they just wait for the right moment to shine again. But it was on the next play that Walt's true genius emerged, as he saw something in the Riverside defense that transported him back to his own playing days. They're running the same coverage Highland Park used to shut us down, he told Tyler during the timeout, his voice steady with certainty. Same safety rotation, same linebacker drop. I know exactly how to beat it because I've seen it before, and I've been waiting 40 years to call this play again. Thunder 42 was a play that existed in Walt's memory but nowhere in the current playbook. A perfectly timed crossing route that required split-second timing and absolute trust between quarterback and receiver. Walt explained it to Tyler and senior captain Marcus Washington, watching their faces transform from confusion to understanding to excitement as they realized they were about to run a piece of Millfield history. The play required Tyler to throw before the receiver made his cut, trusting that Marcus would be exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. As the team broke the huddle, Walt felt the weight of legacy settling on his shoulders. Not the burden of the past, but the responsibility of the present moment. He was no longer just a former champion watching from the stands. He was a coach, a mentor, a bridge between generations of Eagle football. The Friday night lights seemed brighter, the crowd louder, the moment more electric than anything he'd experienced since hanging up his cleats. This was his chance to prove that championships weren't just about the players who won them, but about the wisdom they could pass on to the next generation ready to chase their own dreams. The snap count echoed across Memorial Stadium as 15,000 voices held their breath. Watching Tyler Mendez take the snap and begin his drop back, the weight of 40 years of Millfield football history riding on his right arm. Walt stood, motionless on the sideline, his weathered hands clenched into fists as the play he'd called 40 years ago unfolded in real time. The ghost of Thunder 42 brought back to life by a new generation of Eagles. The Riverside defense rotated exactly as Walt had predicted, the safety biting on the play-action fake, just like Highland Park had done in 1983. Leaving Marcus Washington alone over the middle with nothing but grass between him and the goal line. Tyler's throw was perfect, a tight spiral that cut through the humid October air like a prayer answered. Finding Marcus in stride as he crossed into the end zone with 2:47 left on the clock. The stadium erupted in a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. 15,000 voices releasing 40 years of pent-up emotion as the scoreboard flashed 21-20 and hope flooded back into Millfield's collective heart. Walt, felt his knees buckle as players mobbed each other on the field. The weight of the moment overwhelming him as tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. But championship moments require championship composure, and Walt quickly regained his focus. As the Eagles lined up for the two-point conversion that would give them the lead, he called timeout, gathering the offense around him like he'd done countless times in youth league. Feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with having the game in your hands. "Gentlemen, this is what you dream about," he told them, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "One play, 2 yards, and you're district champions. Forget everything else, just execute." The play Walt called was brutally simple. Power run behind the left guard. The same play Millfield had used to punch in the winning score against Highland Park in 1983. Running back Deshaun Miller took the handoff and followed his blockers into the teeth of the Riverside defense, stretching the ball across the goal line as bodies piled on top of him in a mass of green and gold uniforms. The referee's arms shot skyward, and Memorial Stadium became a cathedral of celebration as Millfield took their first lead of the night. 22-21, with 2:39 left to play. Riverside wasn't finished. Mounting a desperate drive that reached the Millfield 30-yard line with 47 seconds remaining, their quarterback finding seams in a defense that had played above their heads all night. Walt paced the sideline, offering encouragement to defensive players he'd never coached but somehow felt responsible for. Watching as they dug deep and found the strength that championship teams discover in their darkest moments. The crowd was on its feet, voices hoarse from cheering, as the final seconds of regulation ticked away. With 12 seconds left, Riverside faced 4th and 6 from the 28-yard line, their season hanging in the balance, just like Mill had been moments earlier. Walt felt his heart hammering in his chest as he watched the play unfold. Seeing the Riverside quarterback scramble desperately to his right, buying time as receivers tried to get open in the end zone. The pass was high and off target, falling incomplete as time expired. And suddenly, Memorial Stadium exploded in a celebration 40 years in the making. Players poured onto the field from the sidelines as Walt stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. He'd come to the stadium as an honored guest, a relic of championship past, but he was leaving as something more, a coach, a mentor, a man who'd proven that some fires never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to ignite again. Tyler Mendez found him in the chaos, tears streaming down his young face as he wrapped Walt in a hug that bridged for decades of Millfield football tradition. "Coach Greene," he shouted over the noise, "we did it. We actually did it." And in that moment, Walt realized that this championship belonged to both of them. The boy who'd thrown the passes and the man who'd remembered how to call them. Asterisk, the celebration lasted well past midnight, spilling from Memorial Stadium onto Main Street, as the entire town of Millfield seemed to emerge from their homes to embrace their heroes and their unlikely coach. Walt found himself hoisted onto the shoulders of players young enough to be his grandchildren, carried around the field like a conquering general while the Friday night lights bathed everything in golden glory. The scoreboard still showed 22-21. Frozen in time like a photograph, preserving the moment when past and present collided to create something magical that would be talked about for the next 40 years. By Monday morning, college scouts were calling Tyler Mendez with scholarship offers, and ESPN had picked up the story of the 61-year-old former quarterback who'd stepped off the sidelines to lead his old team to victory. Walt sat in his den, surrounded by new newspaper clippings and interview requests, marveling at how quickly life could change when you stopped watching and started participating. The phone rang constantly with reporters wanting to know the secret, as if there was some formula for turning memories into victories. But Walt knew the truth was simpler. Sometimes you just have to trust that the lessons you learned 40 years ago are still worth teaching today. The real transformation, though, was in the community itself, as Millfield rediscovered what it meant to believe in itself again. The Friday night lights seemed brighter, the crowds louder, the dreams bigger as a new generation of kids started throwing footballs in their backyards, imagining themselves as the next Walt Greene or Tyler Mendez. Coach Ramirez recovered from his ankle injury, asked Walt to stay on as an assistant coach. And for the first time in decades, Walt felt like he had a purpose beyond his memories. The fire that had burned so bright in his youth hadn't died. It had just been waiting for the right moment to illuminate the path for others to follow. Proving that champions aren't just made on Friday nights, but in every moment when someone chooses to believe that greatness is still possible.